A lot of the teachings that my grandfather gave me in the years that I spent living with him, a lot of the teachings were all about, understanding my law, being L-O-R-E, and that law of understanding of my dreaming and the dreaming of the knowledge that my family was passing down to me. And a lot of our dreaming and a lot of our law is based around the Malapa or the Mapa, which is the traditional healing, and it's all a relative connection based on the Milky Way and the Seven Sisters of what we know as Pleiades. But there's always been a constant knowledge or a constant communication on the behalf of our old people with these seven beautiful sisters. And so this next piece is based all around the language that we share with these seven sisters in the connection to our traditional healing. From my foster families and families around me, which were Polynesian, with a Samoan mother and a Māori father. And so the Polynesian culture was a huge part of my life and a huge part of my upbringing. In fact, as a young person, I used to dance in all the traditional Sasa or the Samoan slap dances, and I used to dance in all the kapahakas. And I was taught from a young age all about understanding what the Māori know as the kanga whenua, and the mana, the strength that comes from the spirit of the land and the spirit of the ancestors. And for me personally, I always was able to really connect and engage with that culture. And it wasn't until I was 16 that I actually found out who my biological family were. And in that time, I was going through a pretty difficult part of my life, like so many children that are in foster care or have been adopted, that there's an identity crisis. And even children that are growing up with their biological parents, there's an identity crisis that comes about, at about the age of 12, 13, when you're starting going into that adolescent year. And I really, struggled with understanding who I was and where do I come from. And, I basically, from a very young age, spiraled into a fairly, quick descent, through alcohol and drugs and all those sort of things. And then when I was 16, I was incarcerated into juvenile correction. And for some, they may perceive that as one of the most difficult, or the worst thing that could possibly happen, but I certainly look at it as one of the greatest gifts that could have ever been given to me, because it put me in an environment where, one, I was fortunate enough to be able to find my family, and then was given the blessing and the opportunity to go back and live back in remote northern Queensland with my grandparents. And my grandfather really rebuilt me with an understanding of identity and understanding of what his vision would be for my life. And certainly he wouldn't put a constraint on it if I chose otherwise, but he certainly gave me the tools to be able to track into understanding essentially what my dreaming would be. And my grandfather knew that my life was never to be living, completely as in our traditional environment, that he really always saw me as Yangara, which in our traditional language means the bridge, the neck between two worlds, that really gives me the ability to understand both sides. That my mum, my biological mum, is a white Australian lady, and so I've grown up in a Western environment, and I have a great appreciation for it and a love of it. And I've also been given that deep-rooted traditional culture from my grandfather, and I was able to, through the teachings of my grandfather, find a place inside myself where I could become that bridge and become that voice that would allow people to cross over and see our culture I remember at about 17 years old, I used to walk to the rock paintings with my grandfather over in Laura, and he would often have tourists with him. And my grandfather was always translating from Lula or Lula Yadani language to English about the stories. And in that translation, my grandfather would lose the meaning of what those stories were, because it was so difficult for him translating that traditional language into English. And so for me, given the fact that I was raised in this environment and English was my first language, when I learned to understand that traditional language, I also knew the tools of how I would translate that into a way that could touch everyone the same way that we're touched when we hear those traditional stories. And that was a huge, I guess, awakening in a sense for me, that this would be my role, was to be able to translate our traditional culture into a way that people could really see and could really appreciate the true value of what those paintings mean on the rocks that are 32,000 years old, and the deep, the deep-rooted knowledge that's installed in all of those paintings.